This is the Nikon 14-30, one of Nikon's best wide-angle lenses of all time. That's a big statement to make, but I've been using it for about a year now, and I can definitively say that. So stick around, watch the rest of this video to see my full review on the Nikon 14-30 f4. What's up guys, it's Project Photography, back to the video, and today so like I said, for over a year I've been using this 14-30 f4 on my Nikon Z6. I've been using it for everything from astrophotography, even though it's an f4, to beach photography, to mountain photography, to even street photography with my Nikon Z50. And for everything that I've used it for, it's an incredible lens. Just straight off the bat, it's incredible. Like, there's nothing more I could say about it. But the rest of the video, we'll be breaking down into 5 parts. First one is about build quality. Second part is about image quality. Third part is about what I believe it can be improved on. A little side note for video. And the last part is the experience of using this lens. So without further ado, this is my 1-year review of the Nikon 14-30 f4. So right off the bat, build quality. I think this was a big question that a lot of people had when looking at a lens like this. This is an S-line lens, so it's supposed to be a top-of-the-line lens, yet it was an f4. And you know, it had people question the build quality because they saw the plastic parts, they saw this kind of locking mechanism, and they got kind of a little more doubts about it. But I can say for sure that this thing has held up great over time. I have no issues with the locking mechanism here. The plastic parts have held up quite well, and just the build construction of it has done a great job at keeping it through its paces. Now, I've definitely brought this into a lot of like sticky situations, whether it's rain, whether it's snow, whether it's beach water, things like that. And there's just no slowdown with this lens. It just keeps on chugging through, goes through all those environments, and doesn't really have a problem with any of them. Now, there is a really small dent like right here. I don't know if you can see that, but there's a really small one. It's not that big of a deal, but it's only because I dropped it. But I mean, even after dropping it, it still is fine. So, and also, I think people are going to question like how the locking mechanism is going to hold up for years to come. And after the first year, I can confidently say it's going to hold up pretty well. And I'm actually a big fan of the locking mechanism because even if people say it doesn't look professional, in terms of its practicality, it's actually really useful for packing in bags, because imagine having to lug this around versus this like all the time. Like, it's such a big difference, and it makes it easier to fit into bags, organize those stuff a little bit better. And it's just overall a light package that you can bring around anywhere. Now, when it comes to the build quality, a big part of this lens and why I love it so much is the weight. We're keeping that weight down to about 420 something grams. I'm not sure what it is, but I'll put the actual grammage up here somewhere. But it's a really lightweight lens, and that just means that I can carry it around more. I don't have to feel like it's a hassle to bring around. Like, if you compare this lens to something like a 14-24, and then you have to bring along all those ND filters, at the square filters with the 14-24, even the 112mm filters, versus just bringing along something like this that can hold all of my filters. These are 82mm filter pouches, and just this is your entire ND plus lens setup. I mean, that's really small, and having that lightweight compact package just makes it so easy to bring around. And that means because you have a lighter lens, you can have a lighter tripod, you can have a lighter camera, you can have a lighter filter set. And that's the kind of ecosystem that you can bring around with this type of lens, rather than something like a 14-24. So with this lens, you're getting full frame image quality, the best, you know, package possible, but with a smaller, lightweight system that definitely outbeats something like a DSLR, because you're still getting the same image quality, but in a lighter weight package. I think that's something that this lens really excels at. So in the long term, I have really no like negatives I can say about this. In the year that I've had it, it's definitely held up, and I think for years to come, it definitely will hold up. So I have no, you know, reservations about the image or the build quality at all. The metal mount still does a great job at weather sealing and all that type of stuff. So, you know, I have no problems with it. So with that being said, let's talk about the second part, which is image quality. And I have 2 main words to describe this lens. It is consistently fantastic. Now, when I say that, you know, this lens continuously performs at a high level. It continues to create amazing images. And, you know, the sharpness of this lens is actually pretty incredible. If you compare the sharpness of this lens versus something like my old 20mm f2.8D, it's borderline night and day. I mean, you can see the difference in image quality, the sharpness level, contrast, all those type of things. It's just massively better on this lens. And I know that 20mm is a bit of an older lens, But I mean, you can just see in a vacuum that this lens produces incredible images, even on a 24 megapixel sensor like my Nikon Z6. It's just extremely consistent. Like every time you shoot a photo, you know what you're getting right off the bat. You don't have to worry about, oh, is the lighting okay for this lens in certain situations versus not. Pretty much every situation that you throw this lens in is going to be able to produce amazing images. And that's what I really love and trust about this lens, is that, you know, it's a workhorse. I'm calling it a workhorse because that's what it is. Even though it's an f4 lens, that's what it is. It just produces images at such a high quality, a high level, without any faltering at all. Like there hasn't been a single image where I took this and I was like, yeah, that doesn't look that amazing. Like it does work. And the thing about landscape photography that's so difficult is that there's a lot of kind of barriers in the way to creating sharp images. For one, the distance between you and your subject is massively far. We're talking miles upon miles upon miles of distance that your lens has to capture in terms of sharpness. And you know, you can't really avoid those elements, but you can certainly have what you can control, like the lens. And corner to corner, this lens is stupid sharp. Like it's crazy how sharp it is. I mean, I couldn't even imagine using this thing on something like a Nikon Z7. I think it would be absolutely amazing. And you're literally getting all that in such a compact package. Like when you think about lenses and how they work, right? There's a lot of trade-offs that need to happen. If you talk about price, you have less materials. If you talk about compactness, sometimes you're trading image quality. And you have compactness and the great image quality. And for, I mean, it is a little pricey at $1,000 for the actual lens, but I think it's really worth it in the terms of the lens you're getting. Now, we really need to talk about that f4. I think a lot of people question calling something like an f4 a workhorse, but to me, the f4 really isn't that big of a deal versus something like an f2.8, like the 14-24 f2.8. And if we're talking about landscape photography specifically, this lens is perfectly fine for pretty much majority of landscape photography. The only times I'd really want something that's brighter than this is for astrophotography. And even then, I probably wouldn't even use something like an f2.8. A 1.8 is miles better. And I say that because I use and I shoot pretty much everything at f8. So there's literally no point for me to have an f2.8 lens if I'm shooting everything at f8. And when you compare the image quality of something like a 14-30 versus a 14-24, they're borderline the same. It's incredible what you get out of this lens. Because you're paying a lower price does not mean you're paying for less image quality, does not mean you're paying for less build quality, does not mean you're paying for less quality overall. You get that with this lens. And I think I'm trying to stress that enough because people think, oh, the higher price means it's a better lens, but that's really not true. You're getting incredible quality out of this lens. And again, like I said, even if you were shooting something like astrophotography, I'd still want something like an f1.8. But I've even shot astrophotography with this lens and it turned out pretty well. It's not ideal, of course, but it's definitely doable. So, you know, if you want astrophotography, I guess you could do it. Another thing that is pretty controlled well on this lens is vignetting. You know, it doesn't really have a big problem with it. And when I'm using things like ND filters, like I'm using a 10 stop, a 3 stop, you know, vignetting is definitely always going to be a problem. So having that not be a problem in the lens is actually kind of a big deal for me because you're using those circular NDs, you're going to get some vignetting and stuff. So if you can compensate it as much as possible for this lens, it does a good job. So can't really complain about vignetting as much. And the zoom range is actually really useful, guys. Like 14-30 is a solid zoom range right there. I mean, it's not, you know, 35 millimeters on the long end, but does that really make a big difference? I would argue no. And when you're pairing something like this with a Nikon Z50, you're getting about a 21 to 45 range, which actually is a pretty good range. And you can do a lot with that. That's pretty much a wide angle to a standard focal length. And that's a pretty good range, even for DX. So, but even for landscape photography, don't really zoom in that much. So if we're talking about just for that, you know, it's good to have, but it's not necessarily the most, you know, necessary thing about this lens. At the end of the day, this lens creates incredible photos. And when it comes to image quality, we can nitpick about this and that, but I literally see no flaws in this lens. It just creates incredible images that's consistent every single time. And out of a workhorse, that's something that you absolutely need and you don't feel like you're skipping out on because of the price tag, because of the build quality, because of the compact size. And that's super important when it comes to a lens that you can rely on day in and day out, especially when I'm using something like a Nikon Z6, where we can't compensate with a ton of megapixels. Now let's move on to the next part and talk about what it can be improved upon. There's really not much that I believe can be improved upon. Like for example, if you add in an entire metal body, I think that increases the weight. And for me, I'd rather have, you know, a little bit of plastic here and there, but still keep that weight down, but still have metal where it counts, like this plastic or the metal kind of mount here. That's really important to me because you can have the seals for weather resistance and so on. But where I think they should have done a better part is focus by wire. Now, focus by wire is essentially where you turn this ring, and the two turns, but at different speeds, but the same length, is gonna result in a different type of like area that you're focusing in. So it makes it kind of hard to actually dial in and focus on, you know, specific parts of the landscape, which is really crucial for landscape photography. But I mean, that's something you can work around and deal with, but I wish it wasn't focused by wire. I wish it was something more like a linear focusing method, but you know, it is what it is. But they don't have any non-focus by wire in any of their lenses for the Z system. So that's how it is. So yeah, I wish they could improve that, but they're probably not going to. That's just a small nitpick that I have, but it is a nitpick nonetheless. So on a side note for video, I mean, video is not really for landscape photography, but I do it anyway. So this is just a quick side note about it. First of all, this is my most used lens for video. For vlogging, it's amazing because 14mm, you know, you can keep it as close as you want and you'll still get everything you want in the frame. And the thing about this lens that I really love is that it's like the perfect weight and size to do handheld stuff with. Like a lot of the B-roll that you see in my videos is all handheld with this lens. This lens is better for like hand holding stuff without using a gimbal more than the actual 24-70, because 24-70 is much bigger, so it's a little bit more awkward and be stable, and it's a lot more weight. This on the other hand is perfect, even though it's only an f4, so does the job very well. You can get a decent amount of like shallow depth of fieldness, especially with a full frame sensor, so I don't really have a big deal with that. And I actually use this lens a lot for my real estate photography and videography, but this was the main lens I use for that, and all my videography stuff is pretty much used with this. And again, I can use this on a gimbal. I can't use my 24-70 on a gimbal because it's just too heavy. Well, at least with my Ronin SC, which has a pretty low like maximum weight capacity. So this lens is actually very good for video. I was pretty surprised. Was not planning it to mainly use it for video, but it's turned into one of my favorite video lenses overall. So let us get to the last part of the video where I talk about the experience of using this lens. And I'd argue that this is probably one of the most important parts of this lens, or just any lens or camera piece of gear in particular, because if you have pieces of gear that you just don't enjoy using, you're not going to want to go out and shoot. You're not going to want to go out and create. And I think, simply put, this is a joy to use. Now, my definition of a camera or a lens that gives you great experiences is something that, you know, you can take along with you and it gets out of the way and it's just fun to use. And this thing does both. Like when I'm shooting landscape photography, there are no sort of hiccups or things that I have to adjust to, really compensate for when using this lens. There's a lot of lenses that you might not be able to shoot at, you know, the widest aperture, or you might not be able to shoot at, let's just say, like the widest focal length because you're gonna have sharpness issues or vignetting issues and so on. You have no problems with that with this lens. Everything about this lens just allows you to do your photography without having to interfere with all that. If you want to shoot at 14mm at, you know, f4, like go for it. You're not going to have any sharpness degradation. You're not going to have any sharpness in the corner degradation. It's going to be a great experience. You're going to do exactly what you want to do. Anything creative that you have planned and envisioned, you're going to be able to do with this lens. Again, like I said, there's no sort of shortcomings. There's no sort of image quality degradation because of the compact size. You get the whole package in one lens. And I think that's so important for something like this, that it's supposed to be considered a workhorse, because I really believe that that's what this thing is, even though it's only an f4. Like if you want the proof in the pudding, just look at the photos that I take. Like they're incredible. I'll show you some right now. And with this lens, I don't have a problem shooting photos at all. Like literally just look at the photos and you'll see the incredible quality that comes out of it. And all of it is because of this lens. I've had lenses in the past where, you know, it doesn't do a great job at color rendition, or it doesn't do a great job at sharpness. Like this is all of that in one package. Or some lenses even have a problem with vignetting, which it do be like that sometimes. But you know, this lens doesn't have a problem with any of that. It just gets out of the way and allows you to shoot. It's funny that when this lens came out, a lot of YouTubers were complaining about, oh, it's only an f4, like it's not going to be a great lens or whatever. Or they kind of judge lenses based off of price and arbitrary things like aperture. But for some reason, this lens has very much gone under the radar. And real professionals that actually use this lens know how good it is for landscape photography, for a lot of things. And you really have to understand that like a lens like this can't be judged based off of the spec sheet, because actually off of the spec sheet, 14 millimeters with a 82 millimeter filter thread is actually pretty impressive. But with that aside, I mean, f4, you're talking about something that has this locking mechanism. On paper, it doesn't sound great, but in actual practical use, I can tell you that this lens is incredible. And if you're a Nikon Z photographer that wants to do landscape photography and you need a wide angle lens, I mean, it's really hard to recommend almost anything else. The only other lens that I would probably recommend is a 20 millimeter f1.8. But if you can get both those lenses, I highly recommend, because that's what I'm trying to go for. I want both those lenses, but that's besides the point. If you're looking for an incredible wide angle lens for your Nikon Z system, this is it. You can't go wrong with this lens pretty much. And I really would not recommend going to something like an F mount, because you lose a lot of the compact size, the stellar image quality that comes out of this, and so on. So that is my 1 year review of the Nikon 14-30 f4 for landscape photography. It's a workhorse, plain and simple. If you want something that does the job extremely well, gets out of your way when you're doing photography, and it's just an absolute joy to use, you really can't go wrong with this lens. So anyways, guys, let me know what you think about this lens down in the comment section down below, and let me know what you guys think about this video. Anyways, guys, rate, comment, subscribe, and I'll catch you guys in the next one.